Before we get started, I have a couple of questions for you, and I want you to think about them as we go through this video. How would you describe your current level of English? What are you trying to achieve next? If someone asked you to describe your language skills in an interview, would you know what to say? In this video, I'm going to explain how to sound more natural and more like a native English speaker when talking about your English skills, or really any language skills. Welcome back to the English with Kim YouTube channel, where you'll learn what to say, how to say it, and why it matters. If you want to learn how to express yourself more naturally, be sure to hit subscribe. I recently received a question from a member of this community who asked how he could express that he wants more advanced skills in English. When I stopped to think about the language I would use to describe my own language skills, I realized that there's a disconnect between the language you often hear when in English classes and the language people actually use in order to describe their language skills. Let's talk about more natural language you can use in order to discuss your English skills in everyday real-life situations. The truth is, there are so many different ways you can evaluate your English level. The type of rating you should use for your English level really depends on the place that you're applying to or the place where they need to know your language skills. In fact, every language program you enroll in may have a different way of evaluating your skills and placing you in the correct level. Some places may have 3 levels: beginner, intermediate, advanced. Other places may have 5 levels: beginner, pre-intermediate, intermediate, high intermediate, or advanced. Other places may have even more levels that they use to place their students. It really depends. Quite honestly, these levels that we use in many language programs are incredibly subjective. They depend on the person interviewing you, and they also depend on the level of the students who are already enrolled in the program. You may go to one school and be an intermediate student, and you may go to another school and that may be considered advanced. And quite honestly, this is why saying you're an intermediate or an advanced learner doesn't really make much sense outside of a school environment. If I really stop and think about it, I've never heard anyone describe their language skills outside of a language classroom as intermediate or advanced. While I do think people will say I'm a beginner if they really have a basic understanding, most of the time we're going to use different type of language to categorize our language skills. So let's talk about the language people actually use in order to describe their language skills in English. If I'm just starting to learn a language, I might call myself a beginner, but I'm more likely to say I'm just starting to learn French. If I had to describe this beginner level, I would probably say something like, I have a basic knowledge of French, or I can understand basic French. Or even more simply, I may say I'm learning Italian, because people understand that if you're learning something, you're not expected to have some sort of mastery. At times, we may get more specific. For example, I may say I studied German in college. By mentioning that I studied German many years ago, the person understands that I probably don't have an up-to-date knowledge of the language. I wouldn't be able to have a lengthy conversation, but I might be able to decipher a few words in German or kind of follow an idea if I've read German. The idea when you say I studied something in college or I studied something 10 years ago is that the person understands that your knowledge isn't super great, but you would probably be able to decipher a few words. If I were to write about my German skills on my resume, I would say something like I have a working knowledge of German. This means I can probably figure out a few words of German, perhaps get an idea of the topic that's being discussed, but I wouldn't be able to translate and I wouldn't be able to discuss this idea in great depth. So then, if we move beyond this basic level, would we say I'm intermediate? Like I said at the beginning of this video, I would probably only use the term intermediate if I were enrolled in a language program. The idea of intermediate seems like an academic concept that doesn't necessarily have a lot of relevance to your real life or the type of language skills you need in the workplace. While most people do understand that intermediate means a middle level, it's incredibly subjective. It doesn't tell me very much about what you can actually do with the language. In order to sound more natural, you want to be more specific. In this case, you want to talk about what you can do with your language skills. For example, I would say something like, I speak Portuguese conversationally. What do I mean by conversationally? When I say I speak Portuguese conversationally, it means I can have an informal, relaxed conversation in Portuguese. I could talk about daily topics, have a short interaction with someone. Speaking Portuguese conversationally does not mean I speak it accurately or I speak it completely and I can talk about any subject in depth. It doesn't mean I can use complex language or grammar structures. When we write our resumes, we often have to abbreviate all of our language skills. So I write that I speak Portuguese conversationally, and people can understand that I can hold a conversation in Portuguese. If I have the opportunity to explain myself, I'll say that I understand much more Portuguese than I speak. In fact, I often use this language to warn people that I actually understand what they're saying. If you think about it, most everyday conversations aren't really that complex or in-depth, and so I can follow the general idea of what people are saying. In my experiences studying Portuguese, I've learned a lot of language to talk about everyday situations, describe people, talk about my life. I've had the chance to speak Portuguese with a number of Brazilian friends, and I can generally predict and follow the flow of conversation. All of this can be summed up, like I said, with saying I speak Portuguese conversationally. Now think about how I've described my language skills. Do they apply to how you speak English? If so, I want you to remember that you don't have to say you speak English at an intermediate level. That doesn't really mean anything. If you can speak English conversationally, say it. Use the expressions I mentioned. You can even tell somebody, I understand more English than I speak. Depending on the situation, you may want to talk about your ability to read and write the language. Most people who've studied another language understand exactly what you mean. The next step above conversational English or conversational Portuguese is to talk about your professional skills in the language. Many people speak English in professional environments, but they may not feel like they speak fluently. If you speak English in professional situations and you can handle negotiations, discussions, presentations, general business-related interactions in English, you can talk about your professional proficiency in the language. You don't have to be fluent in order to say you have professional proficiency. This just means that you have a certain degree of mastery in professional type language, in the language you use in order to interact in these professional situations, to communicate effectively, to discuss important ideas, to present your ideas when you need to talk to your English-speaking colleagues. Does this sound like you? If so, you may describe your English skills as working professional proficiency or full professional proficiency. Once again, this is a self-evaluation, which means you're deciding what kind of language skills you have. But you want to make sure you choose what seems most appropriate because someone may test you in order to prove your professional proficiency. A lot of times this will be tested in your job interview, so make sure if you have working professional proficiency, which is a little bit lower than full professional proficiency, that you state that. But if you feel confident communicating in professional situations, you can say I have full professional proficiency. At the end of the video, we'll talk about what you're trying to achieve with your skills and how you can be more specific when discussing your proficiency level. Next, let's talk about everybody's favorite topic, speaking fluently. In general, we all understand what speaking fluently means. It means thinking in English, not translating from your native language, speaking automatically, being able to handle casual and professional situations confidently, being able to talk about a wide variety of topics and not feeling like your language skills are limited. While some of your skills may be better than others, we usually just summarize and say, I speak Spanish fluently, or I speak English fluently. When I talk about my Spanish skills, I do say I speak Spanish fluently. People generally have an understanding of what fluently means. Of course, there are different levels of fluency. You can be fluent in casual situations, but not in professional situations. You may feel a little out of place in a more academic, intellectual environment, but feel very confident interacting in everyday situations. It really depends. I'm not going to debate what fluency actually means today because you already know I have a lot of opinions on this topic. But like I said, when I talk about my language skills, I say I speak Spanish fluently. People generally understand what that means. If I need to get more specific, I will. The other thing I've noticed while working with so many non-native English speakers is that people are reluctant to say they speak a language fluently. Many people judge their English fluency against how they speak their native language, but to be quite honest, that's a different level of language skills. If you've managed to get a fantastic accent, it's very hard to hear that you're not a native speaker, you almost never make mistakes, then you can say you have near native proficiency. grade. This is a step above speaking a language fluently. Beyond that, if you grew up speaking 2 languages, then you are bilingual. You may have grown up speaking even more languages. We may say trilingual, and there may be other language for it. But for the most part, people will just say bilingual if the levels are just about the same in the 2 languages. At times, people describe someone who speaks 2 languages at a high level as bilingual, but personally, I don't usually use this word to describe myself because I don't have a native sounding accent and I make a lot of mistakes. Like I said, non-native speakers often judge themselves harshly. At times, we simply need others to describe our language skills to us. Like I said a moment ago, I've had to tell many of my clients that they're fluent in English. They just didn't believe it because they're still critically viewing their language ability. It can be hard to accept that you're fluent if you still have skills you want to improve. Remember, fluency does not equal perfection. And of course, when you grew up speaking a language, you can say you're a native speaker. Now let's talk about describing the language skills that you want. Does it really make sense to say, I want to be an advanced learner? Like I said at the beginning, talking about being an advanced learner makes sense in a school situation, but it's not something we would normally say in everyday life. That's why when we say, I want to reach the next level of English, it doesn't really make any sense to someone who's listening to you. What do you mean specifically? What kind of skills do you need? Most of the times when people want to improve their language skills, they say something like, I want to become more fluent. And we usually understand fluency in terms of spoken fluency. You could say, I want to improve my proficiency, but I feel like that word proficiency is a little more complex than necessary. Of course, we understand I want to sound more like a native English speaker. In general, when I'm talking about sounding more natural, I'm discussing accent as well as language skills that help you connect ideas a little more fluidly. But you can get even more specific. I want to speak more automatically. I want to speak without thinking in my native language. I want to speak without translating. I suggest talking about the specific skill you want to work on. I want to give better presentations at work. I want to feel more confident participating in academic discussions in grad school. I want to be able to have more relaxed conversations with other parents of kids at school. I want to feel confident interacting with people in just about any situation. I want to be able to have great conversations when I'm traveling. In this case, I'm talking about speaking skills, but you may say something like I would in Spanish, which is I want to read my favorite books in the original language. I want to feel confident writing emails, or I want to be able to write blog posts. Some people just want to be able to understand their favorite TV shows or movies. When you can name the specific goal or the specific skill you want to develop with regards to your English ability, it's much easier for people to give you suggestions and advice. This is why when people say, I want to speak English better, I always ask them why. What specifically are you trying to achieve? What kind of situations? What kind of interactions? The language is going to be different depending on the situation. When you use more specific language to describe your English skills or your language goals, you sound more like an English speaker, not a learner. The word learner is something we often use in academic language. We talk about in school environments that teachers talk about when discussing language skills amongst themselves. But if you're speaking English in the workplace, in social situations, when traveling, you're not a learner, you're an English speaker. You're just a non-native English speaker. In order to feel more confident about the language skills you actually have, I encourage you to use the language we've discussed in the videos in order to describe what specifically you're able to do. For most people, the goal of their language skills doesn't have to be near native proficiency. This is really challenging for most people. Instead, think about what you can specifically do and what you want to achieve and name it. Personally, I try to avoid the term English learner when talking about non-native English speakers because it makes me feel like we're back in the classroom. But if we're perfectly honest, most of the time we're interacting in English in real life. Of course, you may have certain situations where people ask you to rank your language skills according to a certain evaluation or a framework. For example, they may ask you for your TOEFL score or what you got on the IELTS, or they may ask you to rank yourself according to the Common European Framework or something like that. In this case, follow the instructions. But in normal life, if you want to sound natural and more like a native English speaker, don't call yourself a beginner, intermediate, or advanced learner. Name your specific skills. Do you speak English conversationally? Do you have full professional proficiency in English? Do you have a working knowledge of English? To summarize my own language skills, I would probably say I have a working knowledge of French and Italian because I understand Spanish and Portuguese. I would say I speak Portuguese conversationally, but I understand much more than I speak. I would say I speak Spanish fluently and can handle all kinds of situations, personal and professional. Personally, I probably wouldn't say I have near native proficiency in Spanish because I feel like I make a lot of mistakes when speaking, and I have definitely found myself in situations where I don't understand everything. Like I said, as non-native speakers, we often feel like our skills are a little bit below what they actually are. Now that you have much more language to express yourself, leave a comment and tell me, how would you describe your language skills? You can talk about languages other than English. What do you want to improve next? When you leave a comment, I can direct you to resources that can help you. Once again, I'm Kim from EnglishWithKim.com. I'm your guide to the essential conversation skills you need to sound more natural in English. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and share it with a friend. Don't forget to hit subscribe if you haven't already. Have a good one. Goodbye.